tonight. I think everybody's here because, as we're all aware, there is an unprecedented housing crisis in Scotland. Every new batch of figures that we've received has shown that homelessness is skyrocketing. The situation in temporary accommodation is absolutely dire. We've had an epidemic of homeless deaths, young men and women dying of suicide, overdoses, women being predated on in these hotels, an entire generation of children, because there's families staying in temporary homeless accommodation, sometimes for more than a year. So children growing up with the worst possible start in life, which will have long-term devastating impacts on their health and mental health. So the Scottish Tenants Organisation has been trying to provide solutions for the crisis. We've been pushing for better funding for homelessness services, as well as women-only temporary accommodation, which is a clear need. We pushed, we were campaigns tirelessly for the housing budget, to the Scottish Portable Housing Budget to be restored, which thankfully it was, has been in the upcoming budget. We've met with every political party. A lot of direct actions we're taking. We've worked with other organisations, for example, Scotland's only homeless shelter, which Glasgow City Council are unfortunately currently trying to shut down. But every issue that we encounter, every problem that we encounter, and from the problems that people are experiencing in social housing, with black and repairs, etc., damp and mold affecting their health, to the rise in homelessness and the way that people are being treated by the homelessness system, brings us back to the fact that we need a mass public mass program of public house building in this country in order to solve the housing crisis. So we're very grateful to have Alex Neil, Scotland's former housing minister and the man who got Scotland building council housing again at one point, to outline his plan for how he thinks that we could build 200,000 homes in Scotland over the next 5 years. So welcome, Alex Neil. Thank you.
Thank you very much, E.K. Laura, and you very articulately outlined the challenge that faces us all. Can I begin, and I know I'm preaching to the converted with this, but I think it's very important to put housing in the wider context, first of all. When John Swinney says that he wants to eliminate poverty in Scotland, and that's a highly desirable and it should be a top priority objective of any government north and south of the border. But the reality is you cannot eliminate poverty in Scotland if you only have the powers that we currently have in the Scottish Parliament, because you don't have the powers of over benefits, tax rates and a whole range of other things. And you can only beat child poverty if you have decent housing. You cannot eliminate child poverty or pensioner poverty or disabled poverty or any other kind of poverty unless you have no poverty in housing. And if you think particularly about children, when I was born in the 1950s, there was a thing called the Scottish Special Housing Association, and it built about 10 to 15,000 houses every year throughout Scotland. And every council, almost without exception, also had their own building programme. There were some housing associations in those days, but they were the big powerful organisations they are today. And of course, something like 25% of people in Scotland in those days lived in private rented accommodation. And the private sector was very dominant, particularly in cities, particularly in Glasgow. And a lot of the housing problems we have today would have been addressed had those programme building houses continued. But obviously, as we know, Thatcher and the right to buy brought that whole structure to an end, as it was deliberately designed to do. And we've now got a very different situation in Scotland. The first thing to say is I find it incredible that the Scottish Government and Scottish Parliament declare a housing emergency, but don't do anything to address it. And it's not just an emergency, it's a crisis. And it's not just a crisis in the cities of Scotland. It's a crisis in the former mining communities. It's a crisis in rural communities up and down the length and breadth of Scotland. It's a crisis in dealing with domestic violence because there aren't enough houses for women to escape domestic violence. We don't have enough houses for our students. We don't have enough houses for the people and proper support for people who are currently living in the streets, about 500 people a night. Not always the same people living in the streets of Scotland. And you could go on and on and on with all the list of people who do not have access to a decent house. In Scotland at the moment, there's about 130,000 people on the council housing waiting list. But that's not a true indication of the level of need and demand. For a start, a lot of people do not put their names on the council waiting list because they know they don't have a cat in hell's chance of getting a house anyway, so why waste your time? Secondly, a lot of people who are on the list can't get the housing where they want it, and they can't get the type of housing. I remember when I was an MSP, one of the worst housing crises for people were those who were disabled or who had disabled children. Trying to find a house that was appropriate for disabled people was almost impossible. And that was in a big area like North Lanarkshire. So the number of houses we actually need cannot be taken to equate to the housing waiting list. That is part of it, but it's certainly not the whole story. And the single biggest part is the number of houses that need to be replaced because they're not fit for human habitation in today's world. And I don't need to tell anybody from Glasgow or from any city, but even from, again, rural areas in Scotland, the quality of our housing leaves a lot to be desired in terms of, particularly in relation to energy and the warmth of these houses, but also giving the amenities in place. If you go to Vienna and look at the rented houses in Vienna provided by the city, they don't just provide a house, they provide a community with community facilities. So within tenement buildings, what we would call tenement buildings, there are facilities for the community to come together and meet together and share experiences together. GP surgeries are deliberately located within the housing development. And other facilities, not just school, but a whole range of other facilities as well, almost for every age group in every part of Vienna. And that's the kind of quality that we should aspire to. We shouldn't just measure success by the number of houses we build. We should measure success by the quality of the housing. And by quality of housing, it's not just the quality of the actual building, it's the quality of everything that goes with it to create modern communities. You know, to replicate the big housing schemes we built after the war, well intended, because the top priority was to get people into houses where there was sanitation, let alone anything else. And I can understand why there was a massive program to build big housing estates. You know, in Easter House at one time, there were 50,000 people lived in Easter House. I live in here. There's 50,000 people living here. But we've got High Street. It's a bit rude these days, but we've got a High Street. We've got housing, different housing communities and different parts of the town and all the rest of it. It's not one big monolith of a housing estate without facilities, as were too many of the big housing estates built after the war, with the right intention, but without the foresight that was necessary to build the quality of communities as well as the quality of housing that we needed. So there is a huge demand for housing. The Homes for Scotland, which is the kind of umbrella organisation for housing developers in Scotland, and although it represents primarily private developers and private builders, they do operate with a degree of social conscience for the private sector. They are concerned because they understand that it's not just for them, it's also for people who need to rent houses in communities as well. But they've done a very detailed study, and they reckon that in Scotland we need something of the order of 600,000 houses. Now today, the Office of National Statistics has actually just come out with a report, one south of the border and one north of the border. Today's population in Scotland is 5.4 million. They're estimating by the mid-30s, Scotland's population will go up further to about 5.8 billion people. That's 400,000 more people in Scotland over the next 10 years or so. So that's probably about another 150,000 houses needed to accommodate these people. And of course, there are other trends in society which is increasing the need for more houses. We're all living much longer these days, and therefore, it's not like the old days. When I was growing up, it was fairly typical for members of the family to be living with the mother and father or with the granny and grandpa all in one house. That was just the way it was done. Or at least until you got a house of your own, which in those days could be out to 10 or 15 years because of the neglect that had taken place pre-war. So if we're going to add another 400,000 people to the population, which is very welcome, then we need to make sure the houses are there to properly accommodate these people. So it's a huge task. And quite frankly, we've no clear idea meeting it. In fact, as Laura said, and I'm ashamed to say that an SNP government slashed the housing budget by nearly 30%. Now, it was £800 million. And that £800 million actually has been pretty well frozen as a figure for the last 3, 4, 5 years. So that 800 million, just to keep pace with inflation, should be well over £1 billion a year already. But instead of doing that, under Humza and Shona Robson, he actually slashed the housing budget down to just over £500 million. Now, it's been largely reinstated, back up near to 800 million, no, absolutely up to 800 million. But 2 points. First of all, as I say, that's nowhere near enough. Even if it was £1 billion, it'd be nowhere near enough. But it'd certainly be a lot better than what we're doing today. But don't kid yourself, that all of that budget is set aside for building new houses. Some of it, probably about 25% of that budget, was into funding things like mixed ownership or shared equity schemes. So a lot of it doesn't actually involve building new houses. It involves helping people to get onto the housing ladder to buy a house. No, I'm not against that. And many of the mixed ownership programs are very good. But the reality is the number of new houses likely to be built in future with that restored budget, number of social houses to be built is likely to be not far over 5,000 a year. And in fact, the indications are for this year or next year, it might be under 5,000 a year. So that's a drop in the ocean compared to what is actually required. The obviously private sector build up to 15,000 houses. It varies from year to year between 12 and 15,000 in recent years. So that brings you to 20,000 a year. And about 4,000 or 5,000 houses been built for private rights, usually multi-storey projects in Scotland. But that's not 5,000 a year. At any one time, there's about 5,000 under construction. So let's say the total new build with all the different sections is just over 20,000 a year. If we need 600,000, not accounting for the additional 400,000 people, then quite frankly, at 20,000 a year, that would take you over 30 years. And of course, in the meantime, more housing become unfit for habitation, more children develop, more people get married, more people are living longer, because it's estimated the average age of life, large lifespan, will go up from about 82, 83 years up probably near 90 over the next 20 or 30 years. So all of that, there will still be pent-up demand still to be made. So that's the scale of the challenge. At the very, very least, we need, as quickly as possible, to build about 600,000 houses. Now, if you assume that the private sector, between building houses for sale and building houses for rent, will break up roughly half that, then you've got to find the other half elsewhere. Now, two or three things to point out. If the Scottish Government is spending £800 million a year on housing, let's say 600 million of that on new housing, actually that figure multiplies by about 3 times that of the total expenditure, because what the Scottish Government money does is subsidises councils and housing associations to build social housing. On average across Scotland, that makes up roughly a third of the cost of building social housing. The other 2/3 comes from financial institutions, primarily the bond market and the banks, and some is pension fund money, a small amount is pension fund money. So in total, that money, that 600 million, actually leverages in additional money so that the total spend is about £2 billion a year. But the cost nowadays, because of the increase in the cost of land and because of the scarcity of skilled labour, the actual cost of building new houses now in Scotland is now reckoned to be of the order of 180 to 200,000 per house. Now, we're not talking about mansions here. We're talking about a good quality housing for people with good reasonable space and good energy conditions and all the rest of it. But it's a lot more expensive than it was when I was a housing minister. And as I say, the two factors that have increased the cost of building houses are the price of land and the shortage of labour, skilled labour. But these are opportunities. First of all, on the skilled labour, we have in Scotland still nearly 100,000 people who are unemployed and looking for work. We also have twice that number, roughly, who are economically inactive. And this is largely been inflated by COVID and the aftermath of COVID. But a proportion of those people are perfectly, if they got their health issues addressed, would be perfectly capable and keen to work. So let's assume in total we've got about 150,000 people in Scotland who are keen to work, willing to work, desperate to work, because that's the way out of poverty. And the wages in the building trade these days are very good wages. So if you've got one person in the household that uses a pick, my son's a plasterer, and he needs £7 in a day. And people are crying out for plasters. Tell you, I wish I was a roofer last weekend. The money they'd not be a roofer is absolutely incredible. So it's good wages. So one of the things we need to do is use the need to build new houses as an opportunity to solve some other problems, because the more people you take off the brew and get them into work, and as we're typically fair, it's a good wage sector, that makes a huge contribution to dealing with child poverty. Something like 70% of the children living in poverty today in Scotland are living in a household where somebody's working. But it's because of the poor quality of jobs and the poor wages that the family is living in poverty. So one of the things you do when you build a lot of houses, you take folk off the brew and you retrain them, and you make sure you give them a job for a lengthy period, a trade, and they make good money. And it's reckoned if we double the house building programme in total, all sectors, from its current level just over 30,000 to over 40,000, that would create 30,000 new jobs in Scotland. That would take a fifth of the people who are fit and able to work. So it's a huge opportunity. And, poverty, I remember in the 1970s, there was a report from the National Children's Bureau called Born to Fair. And at that time, as it is today, a third of all the children in Scotland were living in poverty. And the three causes of poverty are low income, unemployment, and poor housing. Well, if you solve the poor housing problem, you can do it in such a way that you lift people's incomes, therefore reduce poverty, and also you get them jobs, thereby reducing poverty. So you had a lot of ACC reach a lot of targets, get a lot of things done with a massive house building program. Let me mention the land. In this varies across the country. If you're in parts of Edinburgh and you've got a plot of land and you're building new houses, the chances are the cost of the land is about 50% of the total cost of the house. There will be cases where it's even higher than that. But on average, the cost of land is between 20 and 25% of the cost of a new house. Two things. The price of land's going like that in Scotland. And the main reason for that is a lot of corporates are buying up land because of the carbon credits and the tax domain for forestation, the old cluster. They're making huge profit. So if you look at the price of land over the last like the 20 years in Scotland, particularly in the Highlands, it's more like that, but not only in the Highlands. So you've got to deal with that. I mean, you're providing subsidies to drive up the price of land. So I don't need any subsidies right away, my friend, because you're creating and making the problem 10 times worse, not just in terms of house building, but in terms of the rural economy and all the rest of it. But the other thing is, up until the Macmillan government, and they had the 60s, if you took over land, agricultural land, say, to build housing, the landowner was compensated on the basis of the agricultural value of the land, which isn't and wasn't all that high compared to the development value of the land. But the Macmillan government scrapped that, and ever since, the cost of land's going to get dearer and dearer and dearer because it's a seller's market. The landowners control everything, particularly the price. So instead of paying for agricultural prices, we're paying 10, 15 times that under the current regime. And one of the things Labour say they're going to do, I'll believe it when I say it, but one of the things they're going to do is they're going to address this issue and introduce a much fairer system for compensation for land taken over for housing. And it can be quite difficult. Compulsory purchase is not an easy thing to do. One of the things we need to do is make compulsory purchase easier. But we need to make land cheaper and put an end to the mass profiteering that takes place when land is zoned for housing. I'm personally in favour of a land value tax, which would help with that, and as well as be the right thing to do. But, in that case, a while to introduce. But in terms of a short-term measure we could do tomorrow morning, if we have the guts to do it, and the political will to do it, is they could reduce the price of land for housing in Scotland probably by about 50% of what it is. Now, you think if you reduce the price of land, it means you get another 12.5% you've saved on the cost of building a house without in any way reducing the size of the house or the quality of the house or anything else. But it means you get 12.5% more money to build more houses. And the other thing I would do is this, and this has been done by Grampian Housing Association and others. But more importantly, if you go right back to 1947, and despite the rumours I wasn't born in 1947, but East Kilbride Development Corporation, being a good example, was set up in 1947. And when they built houses, they didn't just say, we'll build those houses for rent and those houses for sale. No. They built the houses. And some of the houses were for sale and some were for rent. Now that meant mixed development. People didn't know, living next to somebody in exactly the same kind of house, they didn't know if they were renting or they were owning the house. But because the Development Corporation made that the policy, mixed development, which was the right thing to do as well. I think everybody would agree we want mixed development instead of, the kind of divisions we've got in the towns and cities at the moment. But the other important thing than that is they use the capital receipt from selling the houses for sale to cross-subsidise the construction of the houses around. So let's say 1/3 of the houses were for sale, and it costs, let's say, 100,000 a house, just for the sake of argument. You build 100 houses, so that's going to cost you, what, 10 million? But if you sell 1/3 of them at a profit, say, of 25, 30, 40 grand, you've got 30 houses that are making you, say, 40 grand. So you get 1.2 million profit. So you put that into building more houses, including more 2/3 of the houses for rent. So in a tight financial situation where the Scottish government finds itself, that I think is a sensible thing to do. And I don't know anybody who would object in principle to doing that. The final point in all of this is, even with all of that, was saying you build 1/3 of the houses for sale, and like they say, by the way, they can't rely on the private sector. I remember when I was the housing minister, they helped to buy street, to help first-time buyers get in the housing market. And I held it, one of the things I did there was I held a meeting every 6 months with the top 6 builders who's got house builders in Scotland. And it would have to be down south, the Help to Buy would provide you with up to £600,000 to help me to buy a house. And the limit we had in Scotland was 180,000 because that was the average price of a house. And they said, oh no, but we want that up to about 250,000. And I said, well, you're not getting that up to 250,000. You say, why? I said, for 2 or 3 reasons. First of all, national house builders operate throughout the United Kingdom. So you deliberately, and they have a policy of deliberately restricting the number of houses they build at any one time. Because if they build too many too quickly, the price of the house and the profit goes down. And the second thing, arising from that, I said, suppose I'm getting 250 grand. You're not going to build any more houses. You're just going to put the extra 70 grand in your bottom line in your pocket by your shareholders. I says, and I'm not in the business of funding your shareholders. That's your job. So we utterly refused to do that. Not because we were antipathy and antipathetic towards these people. They were good people. All of them were working class people who had become architects and business development managers and all the rest of it. But it Helped to Buy actually defeated its own purpose. Its purpose was to get more folk on the housing ladder, first-time buyers. But the way it operated, it drove up demand without driving up supply. And what we tried to do was say that Help to Buy would only be available for under newly built houses, so that you increase supply and demand at the same level, and therefore you don't increase the price. But that's important to understand. But supposing the Scottish Government did all the things I've just outlined and more, the still would be very far short of money they need to build 20,000 additional houses every year. And there's an answer to that. And it's primarily, not exclusively, but primarily pension fund money. Now, the pension funds are the money we open by every year towards a pension, so that on top of the state pension, you get a country pension or a superannuation if you work for a local authority about it. All of that goes into pension funds. But now as a housing minister, we work with, for example, Falkirk Pension Fund, and they funded the construction of new social housing, actually, in Falkirk. We asked the Strathclyde Fund to do the same, but at that time they weren't interested. And their advisors advised against it. They used to say their advisors were based in London. But things have changed. Legal in general now is in this business in a big way. And it's actually a company with a social conscience, to be fair about it. And it's estimated that in City of London, every year, there's about 250 billion pounds, 250 billion pounds available for investment in housing and similar projects. The reason for that is a pension fund operates over a 60-year period, because that's how pensions work out enough to pay people annuities and a pension, when they retire. They work in a 60-year window. So we've got a leading pension company just now. I've been working on it, and they currently have an offer on the table to Scottish Government. I can't go into the details for commercial reasons, obviously. I'm not getting a penny out of it, by the way, and I don't want a penny out of it. But basically, Scotland only needs about 20 billion or 250 billion, less than 10%, to get the money we need to get the building rehab to 40,000 houses a year within the next 2 or 3 years. You need to ramp up. You can't go from 20 to 40 overnight, obviously. But we are as rapidly as possible must go to 40,000 houses a year. And the money is there. The money is there. And the rate of interest currently on offer, it may change because of the interest rates, currently on offer to local authorities is actually below the public what's known as board rate. So this is a very viable proposition. And it's not PFI. The only thing the pension fund does, you create what's called an LLP, a special purpose vehicle, which is no part of the public sector, therefore it doesn't account against public sector liabilities. And all the pension fund does is put the money into the LLP on a brief basis. They're not involved in any way in the building of the houses, the management of the houses, the allocation of the houses, of anything else. It's purely for money. And they get payments back, but the degree of interest, as I say, below the public works loans for trade over a 60-year period. And in the proposal that's in front of the Scottish Government, if that goes ahead, and the houses that are funded that way, at the end of the 60 years, the houses are then handed to the local authority for nothing. For nothing. They become part in the local authority's housing portfolio. So those who say we can't do that, rubbish. They can do it. The money is there. The methods are there. The policies are clearly outlined in my paper and what other folk are saying. And I'll just finish out with this. The cost of not building these houses is mounting by the day. Edinburgh's Director of Finance has estimated that the cost of dealing with homelessness this year will be £100 million. The cost of putting kids in hotel rooms and living in misery for sometimes 2-3 years, which is a few weeks or months, is £100 million. Glasgow will soon be much the same. You've got discretionary housing payments that have to pay at the moment mainly because of the lack of housing. The budget for that is £100 million a year. So actually, by the time you add it up across Scotland, I reckon the cost of homelessness to the public purse is of the order of £300 to £400 million a year. Now, supposing we get to a point where, and we've got to prioritise these people who need the housing first, if you get to the point where you could even have that, they could use the 200 million you save to build more houses. That 200 million rate turns into 600 million because it's talked about money from the values and financial institutions. So and if you project forward, if we don't deal with this housing emergency in the kind of ambitious way I'm talking about, then if I come back here in 10 years' time, it would be between 300 and 400 million pounds a year. Although well over £1 billion a year it'll be costing the local authorities and the Scottish Government to deal with the consequences of homelessness. So it doesn't matter which way you look at it. We need a massive house building programme. We need to double it. The resources are there. The willingness and learning isn't there. The political will to take this on along the lines I'm suggesting isn't there at the moment, but I hope it's going to be there within the next few months and we can get started. Because no matter which party's in power, once we get this going, then they'll all want to do. They procure up to the credit for thinking up these ideas. I don't care. Let's get on and get it done. We owe it to every homeless person and to every poor child and every poor family in Scotland to do this. And if we don't, then quite frankly, we will have failed our fellow human beings in Scotland. Thank you. Well, they
Oh, well, I'm feeling a lot more hopeful. Right, okay, we had Sean, obviously, of course.
Yeah, what I'd like to ask you, Alex, is that as of today, we got freedom of information about Glasgow's homeless situation today, through from Glasgow City Council to the STO. And where we stand today, it's that we basically have over 8,100 people who are homeless living in temporary accommodation in Glasgow. And over 3,200 of them are children. And so these people that are condemned to these horrible hotels and bed and breakfasts, which are all deemed unsuitable by the Scottish Government and Glasgow City Council. So, I mean, basically, would you see your plan would be able to tackle that within the 5-year period?
well, you've got to prioritise. So as the houses are built, I think you've got to say, well, priority must go to homeless people. Yeah, I think that makes sense. You know, if we're going to tackle child poverty and all the rest of it, then it makes sense to give priority. There'll be other priorities like disabled people. I mean, with this money, you can see a certain percentage, it would be typically about 5% of the money you'd go for specialist housing need, like for older people or for disabled people and all the rest.
Can I just ask just to follow that up? See, Kaz Ray, who's with us tonight, did some research on rents in Scotland and Glasgow in Scotland, and you know there's an awful lot of mid-market rented homes in Scotland. Would the priority not be to eliminate mid-market rented homes altogether and just concentrate on social rented homes?
Well, in terms of this money, because, you know, the private rented sectors, they've kind of halted just now because they want to see what the rent control section of the new housing bill says, right? Because they are worried about it. And I think living rent are the best idea, which is to apply rent controls to the house, not the tenant. Because that catches a lot of the problems that have arisen with previous legislation under Patrick Abbey, particularly where people are selling their house, the landlord is, when the tenant's moving, the landlord ups the rents while it's technically got no tenant. You know, so I think there's things we need to do and all of that stuff. But basically, my view is every local authority should prioritise people on the basis of need. I mean, that's why you got a point system in most places. And people who are homeless should be top of that needs list. They should be top of that.
So would you agree in eliminating mid-market renting? Or I
don't think that frees anything up because it's funded in a different way. I mean, if you look at all the mid-market renting, I mean, if you look at all the projects in Glasgow in the moment being built for private rent, and most of that's kind of mid-market and above, and if it's funded by these companies, it doesn't use up public money. They don't get any public subsidy of whatsoever. So you're not freeing up public money. And in actual fact, in the edges, there'll be some people who are on the waiting list who can actually afford to rent or pay a higher rent. They just can't get a house, even to pay a higher rent. I mean, what happens in Singapore, for example, is they have a national housing agency, but you don't just go to them for a house. When you go to them, let's say you've got a new development in Glasgow, and in Singapore, so the people at the top of the housing list get first choice. So you take the first person top of the housing list and you show them the 100 houses you've built. So they get a choice which house. They actually get to pick the house. And once they've picked the house, they'll then ask, do you want to rent? Do you want to buy? Do you want to rent to buy? Which is another way of doing it, because a lot of these folk do want eventually to go on the housing ladder. So they're given various options. And naturally, the housing agency funds all that. It gets the money from the buyers, and it funds all of that. And you know, it allows people. I mean, there's a lot of people who can actually buy their own home. They could fund the mortgage. They just can't get the deposit. You know, so the more people who you manage to get off the housing list, because you put them in a position where they can get a deposit of about then the more pressure you take off the system, and it means that the houses being built by the public sector will then, many more of them will be free for people who need to rent. The other problem in Glasgow, if I can just say, unlike any of the other cities at the moment, is there's about 6,000 or so asylum seekers in Scotland and in Glasgow who need to be housed as well. I don't think that figure obviously includes the 6,000 because a lot of them are actually bought houses. Some of them are not actually in Glasgow, although they're technically.
No, actually, the figures do, because the figures show that over half of the children taking accommodation are now asylum seekers, and over 2/3 of them in your good cells are asylum seekers. They still classed it. Well, since these asylum, they've got leave to remain. They're classified. They have to be given guarantees.
Yes, but the ones that don't have leave to remain, you still got to house them until they get their
Yes, there's only needs.
Aye. So given the backlog of cases we know, some people are waiting 5 years to get their case here before they get to know if they're going to remain. So that figure's probably, if you include them, it's even higher than 8,000, probably nearer 10,000. So all I'm saying is each area can then prioritise. I mean, there were some areas where, in the Highlands, for example, one of the problems in the Highlands at the moment is they're going to have to build 27,000 new houses because of the huge growth in the economy in the Highlands with wind farms and all the rest of it. The Highland economy is booming at the moment. So they have a desperate need for that now. So they may say, well, we'll do one, homeless person, key worker, homeless person, key worker. Yeah, I mean, it's up to each authority to decide how they prioritise. But the key thing is, I would say, if you made this money available, I think the way for the government to do it isn't to tell each local authority what their policy should be, because that's all local circumstances. What it should tell them is the condition of the money is that you end homelessness within 5 years, say, right? Yeah. That would be a condition of the money.
Mick first guy.
Thanks, Liz. I was really fascinated by what you had to say about the rate compared with the bond you want. And always when you're in a big campaign, where does the money come from is the key question for any organiser. How does that work in terms of a commercial enterprise, a pension firm being able to beat the interest on government treasuries? I mean, is this a unique moment in time?
Well, I think the 60-year window is absolutely key because, I mean, it used to be, and it still is, used to be that when local authorities borrowed from the public slaves, well, that is 60 years as well. But I'll tell you a story. I had lived in America in the early 80s, and there was an old couple moved in next to us. You probably call the condominium, what we call here a tenement. And this old couple, when they immigrated to America in 1916, and they had met from England, and they'd met in New York. They had no kids, and so at the age of 75, we moved to Nashua in New Hampshire in the same condominium as us. And this was the first time in their lives they'd ever bought a house, because in New York, everybody rents. And in America, you can get a 60-year mortgage. You get a 60-year mortgage at the age of 79 at 3% fixed, I think, for the first 5 years. Talk about a case for optimism. Within America, funding is different because you don't just sell the house, you sell the mortgage as well. So all I've said is, I think there's a lot of different ways to skin the cat. And I mean, legal in general, and I mean, they don't do in general for a while. I think so many, and they own car and the house don't. I mean, they're infamous in a big way. And if you get into building in Manchester, I mean, it's a huge building going on in both cities, funded largely by pension funds and financial institutions. It's a 60-year thing is the key. And the other thing is the reliability. I mean, one of the things in the stock market is, as we've seen, if you've got your money in American AI companies, this was not a good week to have it. Given what's happening with the Chinese AI. So pension funds take a 16-year view, and of course minimum risk. I mean, a degree of risk, but minimum risk. So that's why they can do it.
Dan,
another aspect that you touched on at the beginning, and you talked about poverty. Now, to build all the houses you want, it's easy for people to buy. I said, in cities of the rent, the people's incomes are so low that they cannot rent far less get-togethers as opposed to buy a house. And where is the addressing of poverty? The main end of the crucial thing is the rent controls. We had rent controls in the far distant past when there was a Labour government that brought it in and all that. And it was known as the fair rent system. And then Thatcher came along, did away with it. But it's taken all this time since roughly about 1988, I think, for the road to reach the higher levels that it's reached now. But everything is completely out of control. And I know the Scottish Government was supposed to have limited rent controls and stops to evictions and all the rest, but which of course it didn't. As soon as the landlords saw the loopholes, they just wait for it, and then we started to ignore the whole legislation completely. Despite my friend and living rent spinning bases, batteries, micro cupcakes out of the source of thought. But so I think that people's incomes has to be of a certain level that they can live. At the moment, we have a downward spiral that is completely out of control, whereby between fuel costs and housing costs, people we can't hardly afford to live. And just saying that in the future, people will try to live to 90 and 140 or whatever. They won't be living long in the west of Scotland if they've all got raw fuel to replace due to living in damp houses that they cannot heat. And no matter what the remedy is for their spore invasion in their houses, it will not mean a thing if people cannot heat their houses because they can't afford the bills. So we've got a completely artificial situation with the so-called market and the cost of people heating their homes. We're told about cats that get lifted fires and hired. Well, that's not cat. How can a cat be not a cat when they do what they say every few months and allow sending monopolists to charge people higher prices for heating their homes? And of course, as I say, the housing rent situation is completely out of control, whether it's housing associations or the traditional private rented sector. Until these 2 points of people's ability to pay are addressed, in other words, it has to be cheaper for people to live. Until these are addressed, all the rest is pie in the sky. And I mean, my slogan over the years has been housing, health, and education, which is good old, not really, John Wheatley. His whole basis about advocating for council housing was on the grounds of health. And we're now back to the grounds of health, especially in terms of Western Scotland, because of the climate we have. And it's simply not being addressed. And a lot of what you say, I think, is very good. The only thing missing is a freshen up people's incomes, because people are not working in factories. I agree with what you say about the building trade and people, but these things need to be promoted so that we can have some kind of municipal socialism or Keynesianism or whatever, to stimulate local economies, not end up stimulating a whole region or a nation or whatever, with that multiplied effect, which is definitely what we need. But as long as really landlords, both in the housing association sector and in the private rented sector, are just going to carry on being greedy, then it's been a disparate into the abyss. So what kind of list is out of that bit?
Still a few questions to get to. I think that's a lot for you to get asked.
this good is
if you look at cost houses, I mean, the cost of living for people with the roaring the increase too is percentage wise is rising a lot faster than as that people are topping for obvious reasons. And second, I think now some people are paying 30-40% depending where they're living. Some people are paying 30-40% of their income in rent. And of course, you'll get energy costs on top of that. Now, I'm just going to mention this in passing, but there are a few. I mean, I never made how poor this Labour government had to say that as somebody who's a social everybody. Aye, absolutely. I mean, the first thing she should have done in that budget was take control of energy prices. And ironically, if you listen to Hale Vince, who is the owner of Ecotricity, a multimillionaire, a Labour supported multimillionaire, if you heard him question to another Vince, actually quite a socialist kind of guy. And he's given them a 3-point plan to reduce energy prices, the core of which is about freezing gas prices, decoupling electricity prices from the gas price, and also cutting the profits. And the real profiteering is the middle people between the producer and the retailer. And that's his solution. The guy who owns Octopus, which is another successful business, and he's another guy with a real social conscience. And he's put forward a proposal for what's called zonal pricing of electricity. And he says, so that, you have a price for Scotland, you have a price for Wales, you have a price for each of the English region, be stuff like that. And he says, because we are such a huge producer of electricity, that we would have by far the lowest electricity prices in the UK. And, overall, we've made progress on the social tariff. I mean, so all I'm saying, Ian, is it's a lack of political will in terms of energy. And in my view, Labour has missed a huge trick in not taking control of energy prices the way I'm suggesting. And the way these are business people, they're proposing.
And they're proposing get rid of that stupid formula that likes it to the international gas.
It's straight. It's absurd. We're the only country that's doing that. Now, when it comes to rains, I actually built in rate controls into the 2016 Housing Act. I'm Housing Minister at the time. Well, I was the Cabinet Secretary. Magna Burgess was the Housing Minister. And what we said was that if a local authority had an area where an area could be a street or it could be a whole city, up to there. If there was an area where prices were way out in control, rent interest rate out before, and massive far too fast and all the rest of it, they could come to the minister and be given the powers to control the rates. And the formula we agreed was to cap the rent increases at inflation plus 1%. Where the plus 1% was really, you've got to accommodate investment. You can't say that housing poor quality and it's saying we're not going to allow anybody for investment. You've got to have some investment. And so they've never been used because probably a lot of people don't even know they're there actually, because there's been no follow-up in the last 8 years from the administration that's heavily in charge. So the key thing is, I think Living Right a very good proposal, which is, as I say, apply the right control to property, not to the tenant. That is. Now, the property, that would allow you to focus in on the properties. And you look at two things. You don't just look at the rent and the proposed increase. We also look at the quality of the housing. And quite frankly, any house that doesn't meet the decent housing quality standard within a certain time, I think we need to take additional powers to say, well, they're not prepared to do that, then they were going to nationalise it, Well,
I think we're calling more questions, so it's Sir Andrew's first chance.
APCs, energy performance studies, you don't need them for new builds, do you? You don't need an assessor to tell you that you're going to put them out. Here you man, okay? Shouldn't that be just sort of dovetailing at what you mentioned there with the Scottish housing quality standards or the decent home standards? Is that why don't you have a thermal and ventilation standard? Because what people are more concerned about is, going going back to what Ian also said, it's about the money in your pocket. When you put £1 in, you want that £1 to hang around in your house for as long as possible. And we just don't have that. All we have is a sort of, I mean, the whole Housing Act as well, and housing in general, is a smoking mirrors situation, particularly for social tenants. You know, we had that practical experience in Woodside, but we have a very quirky building. We have a flat roof that's got 12.5 millimetres of insulation in it. That's legal. And it's got an EPCC. In fact, the Housing Association somehow has managed to get an EPC-B on one of the flats in the same location. You know, it's leaky, it lets air in. You know, it's the 18-year-old double glazing, so it's not even got modern glass with the iron coating on it. You know, there's so many gaps in it. In fact, when the EPC was carried out in approximately 2013, the van just passed by, scanned it, they ticked their boxes. Apparently I had double glazing at the time. I'm now a homeowner now in the area. Apparently at the time I had double glazing. I didn't. I had single glazing. I had 3 metre wide single glazed windows. But, you know, the Housing Association consistently is breaching, you know, the Scottish housing quality standards. You know, as I say, how do you prove that your 18-year-old double glazing is no longer thermal efficient? Well, I went Dunbrick. So approximately 200 flats there, you know, 2 blocks, about 97, 98 flats there. And glazing failures all over it. I was in people's flats. I've got a thermal camera. I've got a damp humidity meter. I mean, we've got all the tools. So go in there and it's like one flat I went into 99% glazing failure, condensation inside the glass. And the tenants are consistently told that, you know, the problems will be solved. But going back to the original, you know, an EPC, you know, shouldn't we scrap it for existing builds and have a conversation and a discussion about covering properties of building and ventilation, and rather than this, you know, these assessors coming up, because the assessor doesn't know. He relies or she relies on the information they expect from, say, a housing association, and they don't tell people anything. And I know this because when we looked at the wiring of Woodside, 40-year-old wiring, I got the electrical inspection conditions report at 2 of about random from flats below me, and there was no information given to the inspector. There was C3s, which means that it's for further investigation. And so the maintenance department and the upper management aspire to not inform the inspector, because that was the only inspection that those flats had had in, I think, the 40 years. So that's just some of the points. I'm going to finish in this one. Like, the 60s and 70s saw the biggest housing phenomena, you know, social housing, council housing. Now, there was a lot of good flats built, multi-stories. There was a lot of good ones built. There was a lot of terrible ones built. I don't know if you ever know about the Great British Housing Disasters, where high-rise tower blocks were built off-plan, where panels would fall out. I've had experience in that, looking out window one day in Roseland, where a panel could fall in for approximately 20 stories up. And as quick as you like, the council arrived and found a new panel from somewhere. Now that panel was jutting out for the bulk of the length of that flat. So when they drilled out the corners to see whether there's tying in the superstructure, we found out that actually it was structurally unsafe. So we know why there was a lot of problems in flats. You'll find it online as well. Martin McDonald had a documentary on the flat that I actually lived in. And, you know, we go upstairs with a chap from a company called Mackie at the University of Paisley, who's quite influential at that time. They go upstairs and they show you that the hook is not in the superstructure. And Marvel's like, oh, what's all down together? And the guy's like, oh, it's just concrete. It's good concrete. You know, those multi-stories survived an earthquake or about 3 in a Richter scale, which I think was during the, late 70s and into budget. So, and I was in that flat when that earthquake struck. I'll never forget it. So that proves that the construction effort, despite the fact it wasn't built plan, is very strong. So our question is, though, why doesn't the government admit to the housing disasters of the past to get people back into high-rise living, you know, and look at the errors of the past and see where they can either build factory houses again, or they can look at, you know, a system built on a different construction, maybe steel and concrete, so you don't suffer from water penetration for your neighbour, or the floor is designed to accept flooding, chance somewhere, and can avoid. There's all of these issues that people have, with multi-stories, and again comes down to thermal insulation and ventilation. And had they built good homes, thermal and good ventilation way back in the 60s and 70s, but they didn't have the know-how that they do now. Why don't we go back and look at building tower blocks? Because if you go over to the Gorbals, all you'll see is an economic desert. You cannot have a community 2, 3, 4 stories high. That's what the Gorbals is turned into. An economic desert. It hardly supports anything. Shops, businesses, there's practically nothing there because there just isn't the economy there. And if we can get back a realisation that, high density housing, good managed housing, what I'm sure housing association can make a margin out of it so that they can actually keep it maintained, then these people should not be frightened of big builds, is what we found with Woodside, that the housing association is scared of big builds. Then, if we can get away from that type of management and coupled with everything that we can learn from the past and have an own discussion about if people did live in tower blocks that are unsafe, people did live in tower blocks where there's rain pouring in, people did live in houses that, that their kid got asthma from. And they can explain to people that modern building techniques will remove that. But I believe the government has to come forward with the designs to show people so that they can show house builders that there is a way forward and there's a way, to keep, communities viable.
Well, I think there's 2 or 3 separate things there. First of all, in terms of building regulations, they're nowhere near up to scratch and need completely modernised. I mean, if you look at the problems we've had with Iraq, not to mention the Greenfield type cladding and all the rest of it, is very clear that and people's confidence has been badly shaken. Not all of this is affecting multi-stories. I mean, the rack is not a multi-story problem, although the Greenfield shielding is a problem for flats above 5. I think it's above 5 stories.
Yeah, we would be building to TV standards. Yeah, we would be showing people how.
And Italy will have a chance to chat some more afterwards, but I know there's 3 other people who have questions to ask.
But generally, I'm with you on this. I think we need to bring this whole legislation on building materials and all the rest of it totally up to a modern standard. And I don't think we can ignore existing houses. I think there's still an issue in there that needs to be addressed. I don't think it's been properly or effectively addressed. I also think, for example, if you buy a private house, then you get an NHBC certificate for 10 years who are supposed to deal with structural faults. I actually think that system is faulty. But if people who buy houses get that kind of guarantee, I would not giving the same guarantee to people who rent houses. I mean, they're treated as second-class citizens. They should get the same guarantees, quite frankly, for the first 10 years. As there are people who buy houses. So in all of that, I totally agree with you. Why the government not doing it? Why they're not doing a lot of things?
William. Sorry, do you know a question? No? A gentleman behind you.
Back to the talks, very interesting, and sort of lost it. Thank you very much. You were talking about land, and I was actually quite surprised that the cost of land for the house is, where did you say something? 2.5%. That's an average across Scotland. That's an average done, because I know that England is 70%. According to Bear Christie, houses are ended up with this, and actually globally, it's up to like 80%. Yeah. I may have underestimated it. That was a figure out as a few years ago. Yeah, I would be surprised. It's crashing again now. I just wanted to make the point. Yeah, we shouldn't be getting ripped off in terms of compensation to the landlord. No, and I think that's really important. I suppose in relationship up to that is kind of because you mentioned like subsidies for that would help and maximize
All that was credits. Or so, for example, if you take agricultural land and build forestry on it, you'll get a lot of money from the government. But also all of these things, it means the land that's left and not for forestry, that you're driving up the price of the land. And also, for example, in pre-land use restoration, they're getting huge subsidies for just leaving the in the land. I can understand that. The why didn't we just do what Denmark does and tell the landowner
they're going to keep the peak where it is for the sake of climate change. Why do we have to subsidise them all the time? These people, Prince Charles, King Charles gets all these something.
So if you just need them, that's a very intention to pass you on land nearby because of these credits or agricultural land, yeah. Right, nice. They're drowning up. What's happening is, and this partly I think has driven the government to tax farms for inheritance tax, because the price of land's been going up so high, on average. I don't think they've gone about it the right way, by the way. I've done it differently, but anyway. But the point is, the land, the people who own land are making a fortune in most cases. And I think we should be clapping down on that because, quite frankly, it's making housing much more expensive. And these